Hello everyone and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia lost can be found. Another couple weeks have come and gone and it's time for a new full-length summon showcase. So this time around we have a normal showcase. There was a mistake on the Nintendo of America Twitter where it was announced that this would include limited time adventurers, dragons, and Wyrmprints, but that has since been corrected. This is a normal showcase, meaning everything you can summon here is going to be added to the normal summoning pool after the showcase ends. As usual, there are a number of rate-up Wyrmprints, dragons, and adventurers on this showcase, and we're going to talk about them all today. Of course, with a new showcase means a new giveaway, so there is a link to the Gleam giveaway in the description below if you'd like to participate. I've put timestamps up on the screen now. The theme on this showcase is, of course, Circus, and it's related to the current facility event. That does mean that some of the Wyrmprints here are going to increase your rewards during that event, and this is another light showcase, the third since the game launched. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the Wyrmprints, then the dragons, and finally we'll talk about the adventurers. So the first Wyrmprint on focus is the featured 3-star Welcome One and All. This Wyrmprint provides skill prep up to 15%, and it's also going to help you during the facility event with your intake of Tent Canvas for leveling up your facility and for unlocking some of the rewards in the treasure trade. Just like with most 3-star Wyrmprints, this is one I would suggest selling. You can get higher amounts of skill prep on higher rarity Wyrmprints, even ones that have been released for free, like a slice of Dragalia during the Christmas or Dragalia facility event. So this is one I would sell, but keep during the event so that you can get that extra bonus to collecting Tent Canvas. The next Wyrmprint on focus is Slow and Steady, and this one is a new addition to the pool as well. It's going to also provide a bonus to Tent Canvas, and its two abilities are Poison Res, which goes up to 25%, and Shadow Res, which goes up to 5%. So you can think of this Wyrmprint as a cross between two existing 4-star Wyrmprints. One is Braving the Unknown, which provided a similar amount of Poison Res, and the other is Lord of the Skies, which provides the same amount of Shadow Res, but instead has Overdrive Punisher as its other ability. So generally speaking, these more defensive Wyrmprints I don't think are the greatest with the way the game is right now. There is potential with the announcement of a possible dual Wyrmprint system in What's Ahead Part 2 that these Wyrmprints will get better, but specifically I think the Wyrmprints will get better where the status condition aligns with that High Dragon. So that would mean I think a Wyrmprint that provides Curse Res is a little bit better than one that provides Poison Res. Having said that, one of the places you face poison a lot besides the current facility event is on Shadow Imperial Onslaught, and that is a kind of tough map. So this could be kind of nice for that map, or just to give a character like a 3-star a little bit more Poison Res. Once again, it's one I would hang on to for the duration of the event for its Tent Canvas ability, but after the event I might consider selling this. Personally, as a 4-star or above, it's one that I would keep for the collection, but if you don't really have a need for Poison Res or Shadow Res, it's probably one that isn't too bad to sell. From there, we get into the second featured 4-star Wyrmprint. This is one from the existing pool, and it's Flower in the Fray. Now, this is one of my favorite 4-star offensive Wyrmprints. It has that highest strength among 4-star Wyrmprints of 52 at level 80 if you're able to max unbind it, and it provides 15% skill damage and 13% critical damage once it's fully upgraded. So generally speaking, I think those two abilities are fairly universal. Obviously, you want this on an attacker with a quick to charge for a skill or multiple attacking skills. That way you can really utilize that skill damage. And if the character interacts with criticals, like has an ability like Flurry Devastation or has a critical rate co-ability, so I'm thinking of characters like Orsum and Luther here, then this will be a particularly good Wyrmprint for them. Having said all of that though, I don't think this is a must-have Wyrmprint. If you've been collecting free Wyrmprints for a while, you'll likely have something like Plunder Pals or an equivalent 5-star that is going to give you a good amount of stats and some skill damage. So just think about whether you really need this. It is a good Wyrmprint, it's quite powerful, but I don't think it's really necessary. And even if you lack a 5-star Wyrmprint that provides skill damage, there are other 4-star Wyrmprints with similar stats that I've shown here that just provide different mixes of skill damage and critical damage, or things like Striker Strength in the case of Together We Stand. So just keep that in mind that this is not your only aggressive 4-star option. From there, we get to the first featured 5-star Wyrmprint, Dragon and Tamer. Now this one has some really beautiful artwork of Annelie and Liger, and once it's been unbound twice, I have to say the artwork is really dazzling. It really befits the circus theme. As for the Wyrmprint itself, it does have a decent amount of strength and a good amount of HP. It skews a little bit more toward the HP, but it's somewhere in the middle. And it has a new type of ability. So in the past couple showcases, we've seen Wyrmprints whose abilities are locked behind certain elements. And in this case, we have an ability for the first time locked behind a certain weapon type. So Lance skill damage increases attack skill damage by 30 or 35% once max unbound if the equipped unit wields a lance. Now besides that ability, any unit that equips this Wyrmprint is going to get 5 or 8% shadow res depending on the unbinding, and this Wyrmprint is also going to be useful for increasing renown intake for the duration of this event. So I would analyze this similarly to Flower in the Fray that we looked at previously, where yes, you are getting a lot of skill damage, and specifically for lance units, but the drawback to this is you probably have other options that are more universal that can replace it. You probably already have things available to you. And really, this is only optimized when you get to take advantage of both the Shadow Res and the Lance skill damage ability. So the candidates who could do that best are, of course, Annelie, who's new to this showcase, Halloween Ellison, for those of you who are able to pick her up, especially since both of them have 2 attacking skills. And then the other 2 light lances are a bit worse, so those are Ryozen and Malka. Since they're more support types or they're tanks, they have a mix of attacking skills and buffs, so I really think that those 2 5-stars are the best users of this. You have to ask yourself whether it's really worth trying to fully unbind this and what the benefit will be to you relative to a simple skill damage Wyrmprint like Plunder Pals, like Valiant Crown, or even Luca's Prank, for instance. So I just think that even though this will give you some really big numbers on your Lance attackers, especially with one of those 5-stars, it's generally not worth it. It will look a little bit better once we can equip 2 Wyrmprints, but as of now, we only know that that's probably coming after the end of February. So if you pick this up, hang on to it, but I wouldn't start to unbind this or anything like that unless you have one of those characters who's really your favorite, like Annelie or Halloween Ellison, and you use them for all types of content. Now, the final Wyrmprint that we have today is Stellar Show, and this one I like a lot better. So of course, the artwork has Fritz, looking really cool, throwing daggers, with that one dagger between his teeth. I think that's a really nice touch. And the refined artwork, as we'll see in a moment, is just as radiant as on the previous Wyrmprint. Now this Wyrmprint skews heavily towards strength. It's in that upper echelon of 5-star Wyrmprints, so that is very good to see. And the abilities on this Wyrmprint are also very powerful. The first ability can provide force strike damage of 30 or 40%, and the second ability provides critical damage of 10 or 13%, depending on the unbinding of this Wyrmprint. This also has another ability that increases your renown intake, but really I would say the force strike ability is the one that stands out here. So previously, the Wyrmprint at 5-star that most interacted with force strikes and enhanced their damage was Night Stalker, which had a second ability that increased your freeze resistance. So unless that freeze res was particularly relevant, say on Water Imperial Onslaught, this wasn't a necessarily great choice for your force strike damage. Oftentimes people would use things like the Warrioresses, which is the other comparison I would make because it has the same critical damage and force strike abilities just in lower amounts. So this is actually a quite powerful Wyrmprint for any character who utilizes force strikes. One thing to always keep in mind right now is that the AI won't do force strikes, so this is something that's best on your leader or on a character you're controlling directly. Now it's perfect for Fritz because Fritz's kit, as we'll see, interacts with force strikes, and as a dagger user he has that heightened critical rate co-ability that he gives to the team. So this is a pretty powerful Wyrmprint for someone like Xander, Fritz, any character who wants to be doing a lot of force strikes, and I do think this is probably the highlight among the Wyrmprints here. But looking back as a whole, I would say welcome one and all, not the greatest. Dragon and Tamer, pretty specific in its use, and slow and steady, okay once max unbound with that 25% poison res. So all in all, I do think the Wyrmprints on this showcase are a little bit weak. Next up, we're going to move on to dragons, and first we have the featured 4-star dragon, Unicorn. Now, Unicorn is a light dragon who provides HP of 30 or 45% when she's max unbound, and Unicorn, among the 4-star HP dragons, I feel like she is a little bit unremarkable. So Strabog, the wind-based dragon, he has a nice secondary effect on his skill where he draws in enemies. And Phoenix, of course, has an extremely unique skill where she heals the team and provides regen. But Unicorn just deals damage in a direct line ahead, which can miss if you're not careful about how you line it up. The main advantage to her is her accessibility for your healers. And there are a lot of light healers. There are 5. So if you don't have any other light HP dragons, Unicorn is going to be a good candidate to put on those healers. Moving on from there, we get to our new dragon, the featured 5-star Liger. Now, Liger is a mixed dragon, meaning he provides both HP and strength of 20 or 30% if you're able to max unbind him. And Liger's skill, Lightning Blitz, deals damage directly ahead and inflicts paralysis. So these mixed dragons are pretty helpful for ranged characters when you're thinking about something like endgame content and high dragons, basically because many characters need both HP and strength in order to compete in those. At least that's the precedent we've seen set with High Brunhilde, where her damage is so high that even if you want to use a strength dragon for a ranged character, it's pretty hard to do so without the proper setup, and so it's often the case you'll need a HP and strength dragon. So for that reason alone, Liger is potentially going to be viable in the future, but as a dragon, I think that Liger is a little bit underwhelming compared to other 5-stars. Paralysis is a somewhat annoying condition, and it's kind of nice that Liger inflicts that. You have to imagine that most smaller foes that Liger hits are just going to be defeated by Lightning Blitz, and so this really comes down to whether the boss you're attacking can be paralyzed or not. Otherwise, looking at the gameplay videos we've seen of Liger so far, the animation seems pretty identical to Juggernaut. So if you have Juggernaut, you'll have a sense for Liger's attack patterns. New dragons are definitely not a bad thing. There's a chance to view their stories, to get an extra sunlight ore by maxing your bond level, and of course to get some Wyrmmites by getting their bond level to 15. But at the end of the day, I don't see Liger as a strong reason to summon, nor do I see Unicorn that way, because at the end of the day, these are dragons who will be part of the normal summoning pool going forward, and there is a chance you'll be able to pick them up in the future. Right now, they don't necessarily help with any immediate content, unless you're struggling with your light team or with the challenge battle on the facility event in particular. Alright, and that finally brings us to the new adventurers on this showcase, starting with the Focus 3-star, a new Flame Swordsman, Marty. Now, Marty is a defense type, and that means that he actually has the lowest strength of any of the current Flame Swordsmen in the game, and he has a pretty decent HP, being above that of Yuden's. Now, speaking of Yuden, Marty's first skill is basically identical to Yuden's. From what I can tell in the wiki so far, it does charge slightly slower, but that is mitigated by the fact that Marty has 5% skill haste as his first ability. Marty differentiates himself with his second skill though, Safeguard Surge, which provides the entire team a one-use shield that nullifies damage less than 20% of their maximum HP once it's fully upgraded. So that type of shield is very powerful. By totally nullifying attack, it prevents the knockback or fall down that you would face, and it also prevents the status condition that you might get hit by when you're hit by that attack. So that's something I've underestimated a bit in the past, but I've started to come around on these shield moves and find that they're actually very good. The context is important, of course, but in particular for Marty, the unfortunate thing is he can only get up to 75% stun res, and that is if he goes all the way up to a 5-star. So for something like High Midgard Swarmer or the end game, I do think Yuden is a little bit of a safer pick and he's available to everyone. But the good thing about Marty is, with that shield, he could make your runs a lot smoother. And with his higher HP, he is probably going to be easier to get to survive if you have the rest of your team being able to do enough damage to clear the fight consistently. So ultimately, I think Marty is a pretty good character. He reminds me a lot of Pietro in the sense that he's got a good kit, it's just that his 3-star status means his co-ability, his ailment resistance, and his overall stats are going to be a bit weaker than what you'd find on higher rarity characters. Now, one thing I'd point out as well is I like his skill haste on a sword character because swords can fill up their skills pretty quickly, and he's got a still fairly low SP cost on his first skill. And speaking of skill haste, I think that's something I would consider testing out with builds for Marty. So one option I would definitely look at is Jewels of the Sun, to start to stack some extra skill haste on Marty, especially if you have someone like Cerise as a teammate to provide even more skill haste in her co-ability. The other option I would consider would be something like Saintly Delivery, or if you don't have that because it was limited time, then Trove of Knowledge, because both of these provide up to 25% stun resistance, which can bring Marty up to 100% total. And in the case of Saintly Delivery, it also provides some extra skill damage, whereas Trove of Knowledge provides some extra wind resistance. So both of those I think are pretty good options, and I think the skill haste is one that's worth testing out because if there's any character for whom it's good, it is going to be a sword character. Now besides Wyrmprints, moving on to dragons, I think you'll basically want to use your strongest attacking dragons on Marty. Even though he's a defender, there's no really mixed HP dragons, but if you just have him on your team for utility, you could put Phoenix on him, but I think in a case like that, you'd be better off just putting Yuden on your team because it gives you more player experience. And as far as teammates go, I already alluded to this, but I think Cerise is a great teammate for Marty. She'll be able to give him more skill haste, and he can provide her a shield, which should help protect her as well and allow her to keep her combos going, not interrupted by anything. Other than Cerise, I also like Sanoa because Sanoa, despite having sleep res, can buff Marty fairly significantly, and with his high HP, he will be able to stay in the fray longer, and then Marty can provide her a nice shield to protect her so that if she is hit with a stun inflicting condition, she can just ignore it and shake it off. Now aside from that, for weapons, both the 4-star and 5-star Flame Elemental Sword, and hence the swords leading up to those paths, give Marty an extra attacking skill, which isn't bad to have, and it'll come out a little bit more quickly with his skill haste, so there's not a lot of selection to be made there at this point in the game, but maybe that will change once Void Battles and new weapons are released. Ultimately, I see Marty as a very appealing character. I love his visual design. I like that he's an adventurer. I think the challenge is that with all players having Yuden and then some players having Carl or Naveed, it is going to be a fairly significant investment if you decide to try bring Marty up to the levels of those other characters. Alright, and next up is the featured 4-star character, Fritz. Fritz is a light dagger wielder who's a support type with 1 attacking skill, Acrobatic Dagger, and 1 skill that buffs his force strikes, Dazzling Show. So right away, Acrobatic Dagger seems to be a pretty powerful skill. It deals multiple hits of damage directly ahead, and once it's fully upgraded, it has a small chance to decrease enemy defense. That's always a pretty powerful effect, and it can really turn the tide of a fight when used on a broken enemy. As for Fritz's second skill, Dazzling Show, this one enhances his next 3 force strikes with extra damage and the possibility of inflicting stun with some knives that are thrown out once the force strike is used. So this is very similar to things like Nefaria or Hawk or Vita or most recently Sazanka, who all have these force strike buffing skills. One of the nice things about this is you can stagger the force strikes and the buff will remain on Fritz, meaning that if you want to continually stun your opponent, you can do it that way. But there is some tension here because you also kind of want to spam them since you're getting an increased damage on each force strike you use. And speaking of force strikes, Fritz's first ability is Striker's Skill, which is going to increase his skill damage for every 3 enemies defeated with force strikes up to 5 times per quest. So once fully upgraded, this means you could potentially stack a plus 40% boost to his skill damage on his Acrobatic Dagger and on any weapon skill he might have, which is pretty significant, but it is going to require that the map you're on has a number of enemies to actually capitalize on that. Now, one good thing about Fritz is he has poison res, and I say this is good just because this is a rare resistance even among all the light adventurers we've gotten so far. We have a very big pool of light adventurers, but most of the poison res ones have been a 3-star and don't get up to 100% resistance. And Fritz's final ability is Strength Double Buff, which is actually identical to the first ability on the only other light dagger, Fawn. Now, Fawn has worse stats than Fritz, but he does have Curse Res, and so that differentiates him a little bit. The one somewhat disappointing thing about both of these characters is they don't have any way in their innate kit to actually activate that double buff. So to utilize that, you really want to be on a team where someone on that team can buff Fritz's defense. Of course, in Fritz's case, you only get this ability if you promote him to a 5-star, so as a 4-star, he does have a pretty complete kit. It is a complex one that the AI can't really use to its fullest because of its reliance on Force Strikes, but nevertheless, I think that Fritz is a pretty solid character. So when it comes to building Fritz, I definitely think you want to play into that Force Strike aspect of his kit. Any of the 4-star Wyrmprints that boost Force Strike damage, such as the Warrior S's or Fresh Perspective, would be pretty good on him, but what I've suggested here is Together We Stand. This will depend on the map that you're facing, but generally speaking, on maps like Shadow Imperial Onslaughts, where there are a lot of enemies and you're able to defeat them with Force Strikes, this will let Fritz stack some strength buffs while he's stacking those skill damage buffs on his first ability, Striker's Skill. So I do think that is a pretty good choice. And of course, if you have the 5-star Stellar Show, which is kind of his namesake Wyrmprint, that is another great choice because that critical damage works great for a dagger unit who's giving that critical rate co-ability and hits a lot of times, and it enhances his Force Strike damage as well. Now for dragons, Fritz is definitely a character I think you want to give more strength. So at 4-star, I would suggest Lindworm, and by far the ultimate dragon for him would have to be Cupid, because Cupid provides a massive buff to critical rate too. So I think that either of these would be good choices to enhance his strength. Now for teammates, one route to go would be to stick with other poison res characters, since that is a fairly rare aspect to Fritz. So one character I like is Ron, because Ron does eventually get a Stun Punisher ability, but you do have to promote him to a 5-star. The other somewhat disappointing thing about Ron is Ron has Striker's Strength, so just like Fritz, he wants to be defeating characters proactively with Force Strikes, which could make them hard to manage on a team together. Besides Ron, if you're willing to use a Curse Res character, Ryozen is the light adventurer who can spam a defense increase the most quickly, being in his first slot. So if your Fritz is promoted, then Ryozen will be able to enhance his defense and trigger that strength double buff. Otherwise, you could use the 3-star healer Hope, because Hope has poison res and has a defense buff in his second skill as well. Now as far as weapons go, the 5-star light dagger only increases Fritz's strength for 5 seconds, and although it's a large buff, I wouldn't suggest going this far unless you really like Fritz as a character. I do prefer the 4-star dagger Nightbreaker, which deals 4 hits of damage directly ahead, and gives Fritz another attacking skill to take advantage of his Striker Skill ability. In the end, I think that Fritz is a character who suffers somewhat from a complex kit. He's going to be great if you're able to play him well and proactively, but the more that you're auto-battling or using him as an AI, I think the weaker he'll ultimately perform. Okay, and the final new character on the showcase is of course Annelie, the Sugary Star. She is the featured 5-star, and she is a light lance support unit with identical stats to Halloween Elisan. And as we'll see, that is not the only comparison to be made to Halloween Elisan, because this character is eerily similar to her. For instance, both of Annelie's skills have pretty much the same hit pattern as those of Halloween Elisan, with the exception that her stunning display doesn't create a giant pumpkin on the battlefield. Now the actual effects are a little bit different besides the damage that's dealt. So for stunning display, this is another skill shift skill where there will be multiple phases to the attack, and for the first phase, this draws enemies in, increases the user's energy level by 1 stage, and then skill shift occurs. Now for the second stage, 2 hits are dealt, enemies are drawn in, and the user's energy level is increased by 2 stages. And finally, in the third phase, 3 hits are dealt, enemies are drawn in, and skill shift resets. So this character has an extremely high ability to stack energy, and it doesn't end with stunning display, because skill 2, Smiles on Parade, although taking a while to charge fully, deals 10 hits of light damage directly ahead and increases the entire team's energy levels by 2 stages. That is really powerful. That is a lot of energy level to be increasing at once. Now, just like Halloween Elisan had a skill damage ability, Annelie has a skill damage ability as well, well with higher percentages, but an HP 70% threshold. So this ability only works if you're able to keep her healthy, and besides that, another difference is that she has Poison Res instead of Curse Res, and instead of Gauge Accelerator, her final ability is Energized, providing strength. So whenever she's energized, meaning she has a full 5 stacks of those musical notes, or has received energy 5 times, she is going to get a 15-second strength buff. So having used Halloween Elisanne for several months now, right off the bat, this design on this character is very powerful, with one of the drawbacks being that the skills do take a while to utilize, so if there are purple area of effect attacks, it is going to be hard to dodge those. Having said that, Annelie has a lot higher synergy potential with other characters who utilize energy, so that is something to be excited about, and it's something that informs me when I think about builds for her. So as far as Wyrmprints go, of course, one that you can use right away is Dragon and Tamer, the new featured Wyrmprint. It's going to give her that extra skill damage as well as some Shadow Res. That Shadow Res should hopefully keep her above 70% HP, so she gets even more skill damage from her first ability. This Wyrmprint is quite literally made for her, so it makes sense I'd include it here. And if you don't have that, you can always fall back on another skill damage Wyrmprint, like the freebie Plunder Pals, or if you weren't playing at that time, then you can use something like Resounding Rendition if you have that, or Heralds of Hinamoto from the recent showcase for Ieyasu if you have one of those lying around. Now for dragons, I do think this is another character where you probably want strength, so Lindworm would be a good choice. And for the 5-star, you could of course use Cupid, but I kind of like Liger just for flavor reasons, since it's the dragon that she tames, and they have a special relationship and a special bond. And one other advantage to Liger is just that you can actually use the Energized mechanic on his damage dealing skill, whereas Cupid has a skill that provides a very small heal and mostly a buff instead. Of course, the strength that Cupid provides and the heal keeping her above 70% HP means that he wouldn't be a bad option either. Now, as far as teammates go, this is where things get somewhat complicated because your natural inclination would be to pair Annelie with characters who also had energy mechanics. But unfortunately, one drawback to energy is if any character gets hit with an affliction, their energy counter resets. So unless you have Heavenly Holiday to put on Annelie, then having her on the same team as basically Lucretia might pose a slight risk. Maybe if you're on a curse-based map, you could control Annelie and that would help protect her from getting hit with curse, and vice versa if you're on a poison map. So I would say Lucretia is still one great option. They are a very powerful couple at granting and utilizing energy, getting those 50% boosts to your skill damage. The other option I would seriously consider is Julieta, just as a powerhouse of a character. That's a character with 100% poison res, with a very powerful first skill, which would be even more powerful once energized. So those are the two recommendations I would make. Now finally, for weapons for Annelie, I do think you just want to get another attacking skill on there. The 4-star Light Lance Thunderbolt can increase Annelie's critical rates, but I don't think that's really worth it compared to your 5-star option, which is going to do damage ahead, or even the Jack-o'-lanterns at 3-star, which you'll still have if you play during the Halloween Facility event. So ultimately, I think that Annelie is an extremely powerful character, but the question comes down to whether you really need her for the types of content you'll be facing in the game. Just like with Fritz, her poison res is nice because it fills a niche that isn't as full on the light roster that we have right now. But it's also somewhat of a drawback. The way that high dragons have been designed so far, it probably means that light characters with curse res are going to be more viable for the hardest content in the game. Now all of that could change, of course, with the addition of void battles and other types of future content, so that is somewhat speculative, but I will say that if you have Halloween Elisanne, she is probably going to be good enough. Alright, and that brings us to the verdict on this summon showcase, where I'll answer the question of whether I'll be summoning or not, and give you my recommendations on whether or not to pull on this showcase. So overall, I liked all 3 of the characters. I would give Marty a slight knock, about half a point, just because Marty as a 3-star, he does have some inherent drawbacks that if he were a 4-star character, he probably wouldn't have had. Besides that, I think I would put the same knock on Unicorn, where it really depends on what you already have available to you, but Unicorn isn't one of the stronger 4-star dragons that we could have seen here. From there, as far as Wyrmprints go, I'm certainly lower on Dragon and Tamer because of its narrow use. Slow and Steady, I think, has the same criticism applied to it, and Welcome One and All is just a 3-star Wyrmprint you're going to probably sell after the event ends. So for me, Flower in the Fray and Stellar Show are the standouts. Ultimately, taking everything into consideration, I would give this summon showcase about a 7, but really advise that you consider whether to summon on this depending on what your light setup is like going into the facility event. Now, this event is harder than in the past. There is a master level challenge on the challenge battle, and that means maybe you want a slightly stronger light team going into it, because that battle does have a chance of dropping Twinkling Sands. So think about all of that before you decide to summon. But as for me, because all of these characters are going into the permanent pool, and I summoned on Lucretia's showcase, as well as Halloween Elisand's showcase, this one is a pretty easy skip in my mind. It doesn't hurt that it comes after 2.5 limited showcases, where I essentially spent all of my Wyrmite, so in my case, I'm going to be saving up for a while. I definitely look forward to picking up Marty in the future because I've already built out a Flame Elemental Sword and already utilized Yuden and Naveed pretty heavily, so he'll be easy for me to build up. But I'm certainly going to be skipping the rest of this showcase, waiting for what comes in February, potentially related to Valentine's Day, which could be very exciting and probably limited time. But definitely let me know what you're planning to do or who you summoned in the comments below. With all of that said, thank you so much for watching. Remember, once again, the link to the Gleam giveaway is in the description. Take care, everyone, and